I am Dr. Wilmer Leon, and for the next 3 hours, you're going inside the issues here on Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Each week, my guests and I discuss the national, international, cultural, and social issues that are impacting the global village in which we live. This is live, rhetoric-free talk radio, so get your cup of coffee, your glass of juice, whatever you like to drink on a Saturday morning at this time. And let's dialogue, listen, and learn. The nationwide call-in toll-free telephone number is 866-801-TALK, 866-801-8255, 866-801-8255. And as always, got to give a good morning and big shout out to my number one fan, Candace Pay, down there in Richmond, Virginia, as well as the lovely world travelers, Ms. Melanie Ballard and Ms. Penny Owen Sox. Ladies, as always, good morning. The New York Times reports, in the wake of the unwarranted killings of Renée Good and Alex Pretti, ICE expands power of agents to arrest people without warrants. An internal memo changed the standard from whether people are unlikely to show up for hearings to whether they could leave the scene. This while the Washington Post reports thousands of new ICE watchers hit the streets after two killings. Minnesotans outraged by the killings of Renée Good and Alex Pretti have signed up in large numbers to monitor and protest ICE with other activists. So, we now have what I believe to be a clearer picture of the people standing up against American authoritarianism, begging the questions first, is this the confrontation that this authoritarian administration has been trying to provoke? And second, is the authoritarian actually losing his authority? For insight into this, let's turn to my first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is truly one of the most prolific writers of our time. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
And what is the latest book that people should be? I've kind of lost track on where we are in the literature of Dr. Gerald Horne.
The Counter-Revolution of 1893.
Okay.
The Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin.
Got it. Well, that's relatively new, isn't it?
Yeah, it just came out this week.
There we go. Okay, so then that means next week we got to bring Gerald Horne back to talk about that book. Okay, so Dr. Horne, Trump told us while out on the campaign trail that he would protect us from the mongrel hordes of Mexicans streaming across our southern border to rape and pillage our village. And now he's shooting white women in the face and killing nurses miles away from the border. I'll just make that statement and let you respond to, first of all, is that a fair way of framing the conversation and your thoughts on that point?
Well, the United States is in a classic crisis right now. Let's go from the outside in. From the outside, of course, there's the debacle of Mr. Trump's remarks at Davos, Switzerland, just a few days ago, which has engendered a fierce and massive counter-reaction. In fact, the New York Times is carrying a story on its website today about the so-called Sell America trade. That is to say, foreign investors departing from investing in U.S. Treasury bills, which help to support the U.S. government, piling out of U.S. stock, which will obviously hurt the economic chances of some of these corporations. I noticed that UPS, for example, has just laid off 30,000 workers. Now, of course, some of this has to do with artificial intelligence, but some of it has to do with this negative environment internationally induced by Mr. Trump. And then to come in and zoom in on Minneapolis, it reminds me of the former Green Bay Packers coach Vince Lombardi, who suggested that when you're fighting another team, you should attack them at their strength, not their weakness. because if you can get their strength to crumble, the weaknesses will surely reveal themselves. Minneapolis has been a lodestar of progressivism for decades. It's not accidental that the Democratic Party affiliate is called the DFL, the Democratic Former Labor Party, because what happened some decades ago was that the Democratic Party absorbed, shall we say, the third party challenge from the left. But that left still flexes muscles in Minneapolis. And in that regard, I noticed with particular interest the recent comment by Governor Walz, Kamala Harris's former running mate, who suggested that we may be at a Fort Sumter moment. Recall that he was making reference to 1861 and the onset of the US Civil War. In that regard, Republicans have begun responding by saying that what's happening in the streets of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, is an insurgency, not unlike, I would imagine, the insurgencies that once helped to rock Baghdad and Kabul, Afghanistan, and Kandahar, Afghanistan. And that helps to shed light on these jackbooted thugs, this neo-Gestapo, the Border Patrol and ICE, who have been randomly roughhousing and manhandling citizens, not to mention undocumented workers. And Mr. Trump has signaled in one way that he may be in the process of a retreat. That is to say, he, excuse the expression, deported Gregory Bovino, the tip of the spear, from the Border Patrol from Minneapolis to Southern California, took away his social media. But at the same time, on Mr. Trump's own social media, he's still been sliming Mr. Pretti and the demonstrators.
Mm-hmm.
So we are faced with a very serious and profound crisis with no easy exit in sight.
So I'm sure you've heard the joke. I went to my psychiatrist and said, "Doctor, every time I hit myself in the head with this skillet, I get a headache. What do I do? How do I solve the headache?" And the doctor says, "Well, stop hitting yourself in the head with the pan." The when you talk about Trump's speech, when you look at the reactions to it, the divestment of foreign countries in American products and resources and whatnot, we're causing these problems. We're bringing these problems on ourselves. But we don't seem to be hearing from Congress. We damn sure aren't hearing from the administration. Well, we've got this headache. Just put the pan down. Stop hitting yourself in the head with the skillet.
Well, of course, you're aware of the fact that apparently, as a result of a late night deal between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, there apparently will be some circumscribing of the roughhouse tactics of the authorities in the Twin Cities. The House has to vote on it within a day or two. Right now, I understand we're in the midst of another government shutdown. But on the larger scale, you are correct. But I think we need to also recognize something that the Europeans have stressed, and the non-US population stress. That is to say, they don't see Mr. Trump as a passing fancy with regard to the politics of the United States of America. This is something contrary to what we're often told by our friends on the left, that if we could somehow just get rid of Mr. Trump and somehow elect Gavin Newsom in 2028, where everything would be peachy keen, hunky dory, pardon the expression. But the Europeans in particular, they don't see it that way. They see something deeper within the United States electorate, for example.
Well, wait a minute. Let me hold you. Let's pick up on, they see something deeper. What is it that they see? Let's pick that up on the other side. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at 13. We're at 13 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. And again, Gerald, the latest, the title of the latest book?
The Counter-Revolution of 1893.
You got to get this one, as you got to get the other 75 that he's that he's written. I've read 60 of them at least 7 times. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. Right now, what I want you to do is listen to this Blue Train. This is Pancho Sanchez from Trains Delight 2019 Concord Picante recording. Do yourselves a favor, folks. Keep it locked right here. Where are we time wise? 14 past the hour. Keep it locked right here, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. All right. Blue Train, Pancho Sanchez from Trains Delight. We're at 17. We're at 17 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here inside the issues where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. Gerald, thank you so much, man, for staying with me. As we were going in to that first break, you made a point regarding Europeans' response to Trump's remarks at Davos. And you said the Europeans don't see Trump as a passing fancy, that they see a much deeper issue here. And you were about to elaborate on the depths of the issue, and I wanted to give you full time to do that uninterrupted. So I interrupted you then, so I don't have to interrupt you now. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, it was reflected in the remarks by Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada at Davos just a few days ago, which has received global attention. And I should also mention parenthetically that news items suggest that the State Department is now conferring with separatist leaders in Alberta, Canada, oil-rich Alberta, Canada, with the intention somehow of making it the 51st state. But having said that, I don't think that the Canadians nor the Europeans have a deeper understanding of the politics of the United States of America, the history of the United States that's brought us to this point. They just know that it's not a passing fancy, that something deep and profound is taking place. And I think that one of the reasons is that their diplomats in Washington, they don't pay attention, although this is supposed to be part of their job, of the literature on the history of the United States of America, which would then lead them to why Mr. Trump is not a passing fancy. And to that extent, there needs to be a house cleaning on 16th Street in Washington of all these embassies, for example, because they're not really doing their job and they're jeopardizing the security of their countries.
Two things. One, the Democrats don't see Trump. I'm sorry. No, you made the point that the Democrats see Trump as a passing fancy. Well, that to me says that they're stuck in the Trump derangement syndrome, because one of the things that gets overlooked in a lot of the analysis from the mainstream is it's Trump, 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 Trump. In many regards, all he's doing is doubling down on policies from his predecessors. The problem is he's just so much less. He's what's what I'm looking for? He's just so aggressive with his language. He's so clear and blatant with his racism. He's not smooth like former President Obama. And so he's carrying on the policies from his predecessors. And the other point is the Europeans, interesting that they would focus on Trump when it was Joe Biden that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Donald Trump didn't blow up Nord Stream. Donald Trump didn't start the war in Ukraine. So, with that, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, I would also add the point by the late Martinican intellectual and politician Aimé Césaire, when he was seeking to explain the brutality and the depredations of what was inflicted on Central and Eastern Europe by the fascists in the 1930s and the 1940s. He argued that if leaders at that time had paid more attention to colonialism and the atrocities inflicted upon so-called colonial subjects, they would not have been surprised by the Holocaust, for example. I would make what I would call, pardon the expression, a Césaire corollary. That is to say, if you have a country like the United States of America that's based upon indigenous dispossession and mass enslavement of Africans, you should not be surprised that in the 21st century there emerges a potent and powerful right-wing tendency led by a demagogue like Donald J. Trump, who received 77 million votes in November 2024, not by happenstance nor accident.
The words I was grasping for were Trump is so much more vulgar and crass with his and racist with his language. Those are the adjectives that I was that I was grasping for. Whereas Uncle Joe would be much smoother, or even Barack Obama, but they're basically relaying in many instances, very similar messages. Um, so let me get back to Minnesota and the atrocities there. Again, Trump runs on protecting the border. But was protecting the border really the goal? Or was it a cover or a ruse to manufacture consent, resulting in, because he's now expanded the border all the way to Minnesota? Or can both be true at the same time?
Well, it's possible for both to be true, but I think you don't have to dig that deeply with regard to the crisis in Minneapolis, St. Paul, to understand that this bludgeoning of non-documented workers is an attack on the entire U.S. working class. It's certainly uh, driving down the working conditions and wages of immigrant labor, will have gravitational pull downward on the wages and working conditions of the entire working class. Secondly, I think that it is a kind of precursor of a full-throated, full-blooded fascism, for
Mm-hmm.
example, with Minneapolis, St. Paul as a demonstration project. And I think that one of the reasons why, as you put it, Mr. Trump can present as being more vulgar than, say, Uncle Joe Biden is because Mr. Trump is facing a deeper crisis, albeit a crisis of his own making. Recall my remarks of a few moments ago about the so-called Sell America trade uh, gripping the Wall Streets around the world. That is to say, the United States is facing a crisis from which it will be difficult to extricate itself, particularly with regard to U.S. Treasury bills. Uh, the interest rate on those Treasury bills are going up because they're getting harder to peddle, which adds to the national debt, which is what, 38, $39 trillion as we speak. And Mr. Trump has also talked about pushing a so-called cheap dollar strategy, the consequences of which he has not thought through. He just thinks it'll hype exports, not reflecting upon what it will do with regard to imports, for example. So he has been the manufacturer of his own miseries. And sadly and tragically, the miseries he's manufactured afflict the rest of us.
You just dropped an F bomb. You used the word fascism. And there are those who will make the argument that fascism was more of a fixed time in history during the 30s with the rise of Mussolini in Italy and the Third Reich and Hitler in Germany. And so to now use the word fascism is to a great degree taking that term out of its proper historical context. What are your thoughts on that? First of all, have you heard that debate or that discussion, and what are your thoughts on it?
I heard that debate. A lot of it comes from the reflection on the novel, the work of some decades ago, It Can't Happen Here,
Mm-hmm.
which puts forward, at least by implication, a certain kind of romanticized, naive view of the United States of America. With regard to fascism, I'm sure that the Chileans who suffered under the heel of Pinochet's fascism from 1973 through the 1990s would object to the idea that fascism was only cited in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, it would not be unfair to suggest that apartheid, for example, post 1948 in particular, up to the ouster of the regime in 1994, was a unique and peculiar form of fascism. And I think that a way to narcotize the US population and put them to sleep is to suggest that fascism cannot descend upon these shores for whatever reason. Come up with another term, but certainly the obliteration of civil liberties, for example, the jumping out of vehicles by mass men, arresting willy-nilly citizens of the state, assassinating and murdering folks in the street. Call it what you like, but it's something that I hope does not get worse.
I'm glad that you laid out those examples because uh, fascists believe in the supremacy of certain groups of people based on race, religion, ethnicity, whatever um, criteria they want to use. They persecute their political enemies. Um, so uh, whether whether you want to call it fascism, to your point, or whether you want to call it something else, I think it was Shakespeare who said a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. You can call it what you want, but it still is what it is.
Oh, to be sure. And certainly the scenes from Fulton County, Georgia, this past week were
Yes.
quite chilling, with the director of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, on the scene as votes from the 2020 election were being snatched. I recall a piece in The Economist, the British Weekly, by Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith and former Obama counsel Bob Bauer, who suggested that we should be on guard against November 2026 midterm elections with the impounding and seizing of ballot boxes. Apparently, that was contemplated in November 2020, according to the House committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 insurrection. So, a rose by any other name is just as sweet, to coin a phrase.
Folks, we're at 29. We're 29 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM. 126 Urban View. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest, and we've got a number of other things that we're going to cover in the remaining segments of the show. But right now, what you really need to do is listen to this Blue Train. This is Pancho Sanchez from Train's Delight, a 2019 Concord Picante release, and Pancho Sanchez on congas, Francisco Torres trombone, Ron Blake trumpet, Robert Hart on altos and tenor. Uh, he's got a serious crew with him here, folks. Do yourselves a favor. Keep it locked right here. Sirius XM 126 Urban View. That Francisco Torres on the bone. Blue Train, Pancho Sanchez from Train's Delight 2019 Concord Picante release. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are. Sirius XM 126 Urban View. We're at 33. We're at 33 past the hour. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. And as always, Gerald, thank you so much for staying with me. The Senate passes a bill to fund the government amid battle over ICE tactics. Uh, uh, they they passed a compromise spending package on yesterday, clearing the path to avert a costly shutdown. I just wanted to get your sense with amidst all of this mayhem and these atrocities that ICE is engaged in. that doesn't really seem to resonate with the Senate. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, as you know, there's a Republican majority in the Senate. They tend to be idolatrous when it comes to their bowing down before the Agent Orange and the White House, for example. The Democrats have yet to find their voice under Miss Leader Chuck Schumer. And flying under the radar, so to speak, is the fact that the Pentagon budget is over a trillion, heading to 1.5 trillion if Mr. Trump has his way, which will then fund further adventures like the one you saw in Venezuela on January 3rd, 2026, and what's in store apparently in Iran, perhaps in the next 48 to 72 hours.
In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because a couple of things. One, so after the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro, I guess Trump is now feeling kind of froggy and has decided that he wants to ratchet up the rhetoric towards Greenland. Um, you touched on this earlier, but were you surprised by the European response? And what I mean by that is, I was surprised that that Norway dug in its heels as clearly as it did. I was surprised that the Prime Minister of Canada was as clear as he was saying, we now have this break. Uh, things are a lot worse than we thought they would be. We have to move on. Uh, so I was surprised. So you've given some analysis of what they said, but did their position surprise you?
Well, in the larger scheme of things, no, because I think the Prime Minister of Belgium put it succinctly when he said that the choice between the Europeans was either to be a vassal or a miserable slave. Now, apparently, over recent decades, the Europeans and the Canadians, to be sure, have been satisfied with being a vassal because, as Mark Carney put it in his Davos remarks, they were well paid vassals.
Mm-hmm.
But being a miserable slave is something altogether different. And I think that as they look over the horizon, it's not difficult to surmise that if Mr. Trump was able to seize Greenland, well, then what would stop him from seizing European countries? Denmark only has a population of 6 million people, for example. Norway only has a population of about 4 million people, for example. And yet it has a sizable GDP, a sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion invested in every major corporation fundamentally on planet Earth. And so for Mr. Trump, they're like sitting ducks. And his trashing of their societies and the national security strategy of November, December 2025 was just a precursor, it seems to me, to more aggressive moves against Europe. And so they've decided, a la 1776, that they need to hang together or hang separately. And I think that they're going to hang together, at least in the short term.
And just quickly, the position that they're taking, when I made me reflect on, I think it's Finland and Sweden that have taken a more aggressive approach towards following the United States down this rabbit hole, taking a more aggressive response towards Russia. And looking at particularly looking at Finland, because they have the longest border of those countries with Russia. It just made me wonder. Oh, now you want to find Jesus, whereas so I think you get my point.
Well, obviously, there are contradictions. I mean,
Right.
they're finding themselves in a deep hole, and it's going to take a while for them to reach the surface, so to speak. Finland only has a population of about 5 million. Sweden only has a population of about 9 to 10 million. Interestingly enough, London had seized the gold assets of Venezuela before January
Mhm.
3rd, 2026. And now you see the Germans who have gold assets in the United States of America, beginning to wonder if their gold assets will be seized by Washington, so to speak. Many of these European countries are on board with regard to ratcheting up tensions with Iran, apparently not realizing that that is just another step to ratcheting up tensions against European countries themselves. But it'll take a while, it seems to me, for the scales to fall from their eyes, but better late than never.
You've mentioned Iran twice, and folks, I think, need to understand that once again, the administration is looking at attacking Iran, and apparently the logic is that they will fan the flames of domestic dissent within Iran if they launch another attack. Uh, whose interests are being served here? Because it seems as though Netanyahu once again is whispering lovingly in Donald Trump's ear, because this makes absolutely no sense.
To be sure. And I think you also need to recognize that Mr. Trump is a master of distraction. To a certain degree, the escapade on January 3rd, 2026 was intended to distract attention from the Epstein files. There was a document dump just the other day, and it'll take a while to sift through those. But by the time those documents are scrutinized carefully, the United States will probably be involved in a headline grabbing conflict in Iran, so to speak. And we should not ignore the potency of the Israel lobby in this country, which in some ways is more enthusiastic than Israel itself about an attack on Iran. I think it's because they're far distant from the conflict. They don't necessarily have to endure the missiles that'll be rained down on Tel Aviv, as happened in mid 2025, or the missiles from Ansar Allah from Yemen raining down on the Israeli port of Eilat for basically shutting it down. And to some extent, these Zionists, they have to prove their street cred by being more aggressive than Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And so this is clearly a recipe for disaster. And I was heartened by the fact that on January 30th, just yesterday, you had massive demonstrations in the streets, particularly in Minnesota, but across the nation, with the fundamental issue being the depredations in the Twin Cities, but many of the protesters raising this question of war and peace.
Hey, Daryl, I know I'm catching off guard here. Can you play that Rubio piece now? Do you have it?
No,
Huh?
not a problem.
Yeah,
I
go
got you.
ahead. Let's listen. This was Marco Rubio, Lil Marco, as Donald Trump loves to call him. This is Lil Marco testifying before the Senate earlier in the week. Listen, this is idiocy. Go ahead, and run it.
On the issue of our presence in the region, here's the baseline I want to set for everybody. The baseline is this. We have 30 to 40,000 American troops stationed across 8 or 9 facilities in that region. All are within the reach. Theoretically, not theoretically, in reality, all are within the reach of an array of thousands of Iranian one-way UAVs and Iranian short-term ballistic missiles, so short-range ballistic missiles that threaten our troop presence. We have to have enough force and power in the region, just on a baseline, to defend against that possibility. That at some point, as a result of something, the Iranian regime decides to strike at our troop presence in the region. The president always reserves the preemptive defensive option. In essence, if we have indications that, in fact, they're going to attack our troops in the region, to defend our personnel in the region. We also have security agreements, the Defense of Israel Plan and others, that require us to have a force posture in the region to defend against that. And so I think it's wise and prudent to have a force posture within the region that could respond and potentially, not necessarily what's going to happen, but if necessary, preemptively prevent the attack against thousands of American servicemen and other facilities in the region and our allies. I hope it doesn't come to that, but that's, I think, what you're seeing now is the ability to posture assets in the region to defend against what could be an Iranian threat against our personnel. They certainly have the capability to do it because they've amassed thousands and thousands of ballistic missiles that they've built. Despite the fact that their economy's collapsing, they keep spending money on that.
This is the bully trying to explain why he has to take your lunch money on the playground. That made absolutely no sense, Gerald.
Well, keep in mind that part of the demand being placed on the table with the Iranians is that not only should they shed their nuclear capability, which you may know that capability helps to keep North Korea's regime intact, for example. The lack of such a capability led to the overthrow of Gaddafi in 2011 in Libya. But more than that, they're asking the Iranians to get rid of their ballistic missiles, which proved so effective with this conflict with Iran in mid 2025. And so fundamentally, they're saying, Iran, disarm so that the United States can intimidate you, attack you, and a la Venezuela, which now has to submit a budget to the White House every month, so that Iran will be in an analogous position where perhaps it will have to submit its budget to the White House every month, not to mention allowing the United States to take over its oil assets, just the way the United States has taken over the oil assets or has signaled that it was about to take over the oil assets of Caracas.
And I think it's also in that analysis important to remind people that one of the conditions that brought about President Nelson Mandela, or Nelson Mandela becoming the president of South Africa, was he had to agree to relinquish the South African nuclear capability.
Which is quite striking in light of the deterioration in relations between Pretoria and Washington, which will not become improved in light of the fact that South Africa has just authorized the removal of the Melania documentary from South Africa movie theaters. By the way, there are certain wags who suggest that undocumented workers in the United States may want to hide out in theaters where the Melania documentary is playing because there's nobody there. They're warm. You can probably catch some popcorn from the counter, for example. So it's a joke, but in a sense, that might be onto something.
That's not a bad idea. Uh, Interesting. Always leave it to you. Uh, so Trump's, according to the latest Pew Research Center poll, Trump's approval rating drops to 37%, with more than two-thirds of Americans saying they disapprove of how the president is handling his job. Uh, when you look at a 37% approval rating, if you want to call it that, when you look at the backlash that is now the growing backlash that is manifesting itself in Minnesota and in other cities across the country, the No Kings March that I think is scheduled for March, which they say is going to be, they're expecting it to be one of the largest in the history of the country. Talk about the approval rating and the question, is the authoritarian really losing his authority?
Well, Mr. Trump may be able to console himself by the reality that across the Atlantic, President Macron's popularity rating has climbed to about 20. And to that degree, Mr. Trump is sitting pretty since he's simply underwater. But at the same time, once again, we cannot ignore the fact that even though the authoritarian might be losing the sinews of his authority, he has some weapons
Mm-hmm.
to which his opponents might not be accustomed, impounding the ballot boxes, for example, further crackdown. I mean, not only that, but by giving a pardon to these insurrectionists of January 6, 2021, he basically has in his back pocket a kind of rough-hewn militia comprised of the Proud Boys, comprised of the so-called Michigan militia, who you may recall some months ago were accused of seeking to kidnap Democratic
Mm-hmm.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, for example. So despite the popularity rating, the problem is that if we are sincerely on the verge of fascism, then the old metrics are not necessarily as relevant as they should be.
So 37% approval rating. The numbers are what the numbers are. And we've been hearing from some of these Republican-led town halls, we've been hearing people saying, this is not what I voted for. But it is. Steve Bannon was very clear in 2019 on that Frontline interview. We're here to deconstruct the administrative state. Russell Vogt helped to give us Project 2025 and has told us that we are in a post-constitutional America. Now, I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what that means, but with the Constitution being one of the founding documents of the country, when you do away with the foundation, then you don't really, if you destroy the foundation of your house, you don't have a house. So all of this, my point is, all of this is playing itself out right before our very eyes, just as they told us it would. So where's the mystery here? It's not a magic trick if I explain it to you before I do it. Daryl.
Well,
Gerald.
It reminds me of what used to be said in Washington about the breakup of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. That is to say, it was suggested that the socialist regime under Tito had driven ethnic passions emitted by the Slovenians and the Serbs and the Croats, for example, underground. Mm-hmm. And I think that descriptor, to a certain degree, can be applied to the United States of America, because the official line had been that even though there was slavery at the founding, the Constitution was sufficiently flexible and the founding fathers were sufficiently farsighted to set up structures and dynamics that would lead to the diminishing of this toxicity. However, Mr. Trump has gotten into power and has sought to overthrow diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sought to overthrow affirmative action. This has obviously sated the more wild ambitions of his base. And that base, even though he's lost a certain altitude, in recent polling, and perhaps in reality, to a certain extent, they're satisfied with this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which to a certain degree, as noted, conflicts with what we have been told for decades. That is to say, that overcoming the demerits, if you like, of 1776 and the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses of 1776 was part of the U.S. project from the beginning. And the base is saying, no, we like it the way it was.
You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago the misguided Michigan militia that wanted to kidnap Christian Wilmer and the Proud Boys. But, we've heard for years about other militias that have been preparing for and to protect themselves against overreach by the government. That's how they have always defined their motivations and ideology. Do you see a possibility where those folks come out of the woods to, again, don't tread on me kind of thing, or was that really just a cover for the misguided folks in Michigan and the Proud Boys?
Well, I think that you are onto something.
Is that okay? I was going to ask, is that a reasonable question to ask?
I think you're onto something with that dichotomy. On the one hand, we should take note of the fact that one of the reasons you had a partial retreat by Mr. Trump in the wake of the slaying of Mr. Pretti about a week ago is the fact that the gun nuts, led by the National Rifle Association, were incensed by this allegation that Mr. Pretti deserved what he received in light of the fact that supposedly he had a pistol on his person at the time of the slaying. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we should not ignore history, which is that these same gun nuts, when the Black Panther Party began to arm some decades ago, some of them came out in favor of gun control, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So once again, I don't think that we should necessarily be overly heartened by this critique of Mr. Trump by the National Rifle Association or Gun Owners of America and the gun nuts generally. I think it's not that simple.
And, you mentioned the Black Panthers taking the guns into the California state capitol and the Mulford Act, which was the resultant legislation, because folks need to realize there was a time in California where you were allowed to carry openly a long gun so long as you didn't have a round in the chamber, and the Panthers seized on that to police the police as they were doing at the time. I have been saying for years, if you really want to see substantive national gun legislation in this country, let the government see a dramatic increase in the number of Black people legally, and I underscore legally, buying guns and going to ranges and legally training with them. That idea seems to fall upon deaf ears for the most part. But I still subscribe to that. And looking at what's going on around us now, folks, better what you have and don't need than what you need and don't have.
Well, what you're touching upon is something that a number of historians have been writing about recently, which is that if you look at the early history of the United States, the settlers, the European settlers, the so-called white settlers, they were fearful of slave uprisings, for example, to the point that it helped to shape the Constitution, helped to shape local and state laws. And you can make a sound argument that haunting the fever dreams of many descendants of settlers today is that same sentiment, which helps to explain why even gun nuts will do a 180-degree reversal when they see the Black Panthers, and they see Black young men and women arming, for example. And suppressing the Black population has been a long-term ambition of the so-called Republic post-1776, which is supposedly and apparently reaching fruition under Mr. Trump, which is one of the reasons why his popularity rating has not cratered altogether. Because with his attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, by his arrests of Black journalists like Don Lemon, like Georgia Fort, for example, he seems to be satisfying the fondest wishes of some of the most delirious members of his base.
So with 2 minutes left, it seems as though he's pushing the envelope at every edge that he can find. First Amendment, you mentioned Don Lemon, sending ICE into the cities, expanding the or doing away with this, these warrantless arrests and so on and so forth. As we get closer to the midterms, a lot of people are talking about that we may not have he may seize the country and do away with, and you're chuckling. How concerned should people be?
Well, we should be very concerned. Minimally, what we should be focused on is the fact that when you force Don Lemon to lawyer up and to spend money on hiring expensive Washington lawyers like Abby Lowell, you're basically satisfying a goal of tying him up. That is to say, he's not before his microphone, he's before a judge in a courtroom, for example. And you could say the same thing internationally. By trying to squeeze Cuba, for example, you force Russia and China to spend resources to help to bail out the Havana regime, resources that cannot be used, for example, to confront the United States of America. So it's a rather diabolical process we're facing both globally and domestically.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time, man. Greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate it. As always, stay safe. Look forward to having you back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, folks, Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Trust me, whole lot more on the other side. Keep it locked right here.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.